After dinner, Freyanne took Ludmilla's suggestion to retire early for the night to get some much-needed rest. She spent 3 hours writing a summary of the trip for the court council before passing out, and when she woke up in the morning and reread it, she was certain that everyone back in our winter would think she had gone insane. Their journey up and down the Azalisia Mountains, while only lasting 2 days, was one that would have taken months of conventional travel. Ludmilla's talk about not existing in the same world will undoubtedly make things even worse. She threw back her covers with a sigh, wandering around her room in search of something to wear for the day. Surely, Ludmilla was framing things in the metaphorical sense that Clara had back in Corlin Harbor. As beautiful and isolated as Warden's Vale was, Freyanne wouldn't go so far as to call it alien. By and large, she could recognize most things at a glance and make reasonably confident assumptions as to how they fit into the grand scheme of things. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she focused on doing up the buttons of her dress. After a moment, she shrugged it off again and searched through her bags for another outfit. That can't have been the largest one. Freyanne had packed multiple sets of clothing to account for her advancing pregnancy, but it seemed that she had underestimated things. Was that why pregnant women didn't travel? It seemed as good a reason as any. All of the other difficulties felt like exaggerations and overblown worries now that she was going through them herself. In the end, she picked out a warm set of sleepwear that probably wouldn't look strange outside, then wrapped a lizardman blanket around her shoulders. After checking over herself in a body-length mirror, she decided that she would probably fit right in with the locals if she had one of the headscarves that all of their women wore. She cast a clean spell on herself before heading out, immediately feeling the bite of the chilly highland air on her face. The village square was already alive with activity, though its size spread things out to make everything look deceptively quiet. She had visited rural villages and remote towns before, and everything she saw in Warden's Vale was similar enough to them. Except for that. Freyanne backed away as a little girl walked by with some kind of powerful skeleton. The girl carried a basket of food while the skeleton cradled a crate filled with crafting supplies in its bony arms. After warily watching the strange duo disappear into a nearby shophouse, she noticed that there were kids walking around with skeletons all over the place. As with the girl, they appeared to be carrying out the same morning chores that children everywhere did. For some stupid reason, the skeletons were all wearing one accessory or another, ranging from colorful ribbons tied around their bones to straw hats with vibrant decorations. Was this how Ludmilla had so quickly accustomed her people to the presence of the undead? She got them through their children? She was careful not to cross the path of anyone as she made her way to the official-unofficial residence of the territorial lord. Across the street from its jungle-like front window was a large billboard she hadn't noticed before. She joined the handful of villagers gathered before it, looking up at various posts written in the shared script of Riastais and Baharuth. Her attention was drawn to a line carved along the top of the board. 47 days since last incident. The numbers were etched into rectangular placards hung onto iron pegs. Freyanne pondered the mysterious line's meaning. Her first thought was that there were certain dangerous industries in the region. If that was the case, it was an admirable record. House Gushman's mines couldn't go a week without a work-related fatality. Since Ludmilla said what she did about quarrying stone, maybe it's something else. Forestry, perhaps? No, that's just as deadly, if not more. Mornan Prez. Freyanne turned to discover that Dimir had gone completely native. She knew that her inquisitive junior would have used the time after yesterday evening's dinner to investigate as much as she could, but it looked like she had also done some shopping. Her garb completely matched that of the villagers and she carried herself with the intrepid posture of a brave frontiersman in an Imperial propaganda poster. "Good morning, Dimir," Freyanne replied. "I see you've already started digging around." Dimir nodded. "It's really interesting here. A bunch of demi-humans showed up after you retired for the evening and set up a market in the square. It was still going on by the time I went to bed." "What were they selling?" "All sorts of stuff. Mostly unprocessed materials. Let's see, there were things that you'd expect to come out of a forest, but it shocked me to see how many uncommon and rare goods there were. The alchemists that came to shop were all over them. You should come check it out with me after dinner tonight. I hope we get crab again." "I'm amazed you could eat so much crab," Freyanne said. After the steamed crab came crab cakes and crab pudding. They ate so much crab that Freyanne dreamed that she had given birth to a crab. She was able to nurse her newborn child for all of 5 minutes before Dimir appeared and ate it in front of her. Frian reacted to the loss of her crab baby by blowing up Dimir with a fireball, and Dimir exploded into a shower of steamed crab legs. The dream was so vivid that Frian felt around to make sure she wasn't carrying a crab the moment she awoke. Dimir has an extra stomach just for crab. Crab is apparently good for pregnancies, as well. Ludmilla's voice came from the side. Is that so? Honestly, my mother and grandmother have been feeding me all sorts of strange things ever since they found out about the baby. I've had everything from Kinshu yogurt to powdered green dragon gizzard. Ludmilla stared at her for a long moment. Frian. What is it? You should be careful of what you consume, especially while you're carrying a child. It should be fine. My mother said that she had the same thing while she was carrying me. What are they supposed to do? Dimir asked. Kinshu is to develop clear, healthy skin, Frian answered. The green dragon gizzard is for increased cunning. What are you, a potion? Ludmilla muttered, and people say that followers of the Six are the weird ones. That's because they are. While it was common knowledge that people could inherit physical traits such as eye and hair color or the shape of one's nose and ears, those who worship the 6 great gods believed that things like vocational expertise could be passed down in the same way. This was, of course, ridiculous. Everyone had to learn professional skills, they weren't born with them. So, Frian asked, what do you have planned for us today? We need to take care of you, first, Ludmilla said. Me? Yes, you. Your skin and hair are drying out and the dress you were wearing yesterday was too tight. There's also something about your smell. We should have a member of the temple staff check on you and the baby. My smell? Ludmilla took her by the wrist and brought her into her official-unofficial residence. The interior was a smaller version of the shophouse that Frian was staying in, and the entire display area was filled with unknown plants. Lutzi. Miss Lutzi appeared from behind a painted wooden divider. Yes, my lady. Lady Waldenstein could use an examination. Of course, Miss Lutzi lowered her head. Is it all right to use the war room? That should be fine, Ludmilla said. Oh, is the thing I ordered finished? Yes, my lady. On their way to the stairs behind the counter, they passed the entrance of an office where an elder lich was seated at a desk. Frian was brought to a room on the 2nd floor with a large table placed in its center. There were no chairs around the table, but there was a small couch along the wall nearby. They referred to it as a war room, but she didn't see any indication of it being anything of the sort. Ludmilla gestured for her to be seated. This is really too much of a fuss to be making over me, Frian said. Honestly, Ludmilla said, if you didn't have duties to attend to in the Empire, I would have invited you to stay here until you delivered the baby. If I didn't have duties to attend to in the Empire, Frian snorted, my mother would have locked me up in the estate. Pardon me, my lady, Miss Lutzi said before kneeling before Frian and cupping her chin with one hand. Miss Lutzi is doing the examination? That's right, Ludmilla said. She's an acolyte. You are allowed to have a member of the temples in your household staff? Frian asked. That isn't at all acceptable in the Empire. The Sorceress Kingdom has nothing to worry about from the Temple of the 6. I suppose that's true. The Temple of the 4 was the greatest threat to the Imperial administration, so the Empire constantly sought to undermine the Temple's power. The result was a relationship that could be described as mistrustful, at best. Ever since the Empire became a client state of the Sorceress Kingdom, it was the next closest thing to belligerent. The Sorceress Kingdom, on the other hand, was so powerful that she doubted that they cared about what the temples did. That must be convenient, in various ways. How are examinations like this held in the Empire? Ludmilla asked. My family pays for a high priest to come from the Winter Cathedral, Frian answered. Now that we're on that topic, I can't imagine what I'll be subjected to when I get back. My father is on the court council, so he's going to hear about all of the undead and whatever else scares him that I've encountered. Isn't sending for a high priest backwards? What do you mean? It's just a routine examination, isn't it? Ludmilla leaned against the table. Even acolytes can do that. Having a high priest come over takes up time that the high priest could be using to address the issues that only they can deal with. Frian glanced at Miss Lutzi. But an acolyte is still a priest in training. Those with the means would naturally pay for the best care possible. It doesn't work that way, Ludmilla said. At least not in the specific manner in which you assert. An acolyte will still always know if there's a problem. If they can't deal with the problem or identify it, then they can send for a higher rank member of the temple staff who can. The only time you'd rationally send for the highest rank priest possible is if you've been afflicted with poison, some supernatural disease, or a curse that immediately threatens lives. You have thousands of acolytes for every high priest. I can only imagine that the wealthy would be resented by taking up critical resources for a routine examination, assuming people even know this. Where did you learn this from? Frian asked. Shouldn't knowledge of the workings of the regional healthcare and sometimes education system be a fundamental component of any science education? Not if that healthcare system is considered a relic of the past that should be replaced as quickly as possible. At best, the Imperial Magic Academy recognized the temple's existence. How they factored into governance wasn't covered unless one became an officer in the Imperial administration and enrolled in their affiliated university. Even then, temple operations were components of a formula, and that formula didn't require any deep understanding, only that the result fell within a range of acceptable bounds that included the temple's ability to cause problems for the administration. That isn't the case in the Empire, Frian said, and I'm certain that you understand the reasons behind it. Actually, one of the things I was interested in seeing is how you've addressed your public health concerns with alchemy. It's as good a place to start as any, I suppose, Ludmilla said. How is Lady Waldenstein, Lutzi? Her strength is probably causing her to overlook a few issues, the maid said. My strength? In adventurer terms, Ludmilla said, you are around difficulty rating 60. As a conventional arcane caster, that means you're about as physically robust as a strong iron rank adventurer. At least by the Sorceress Kingdom's standards. Your baby, however, is not, Miss Lutzi told her. There isn't any danger so far, but keep in mind that you can go to greater extremes than the average human mother can. Aside from that, I would recommend against the use of any cosmetics unless you know what's in them. Not only can they get along badly with your dry skin, but you may also absorb something unhealthy. You may resist the effects, but your unborn child is much weaker than you are. Nothing that I use registers as poison detection spells, Frian said. Poison detection spells only recognize poisons strong enough to take effect in a single dose. Certain pigments and scents used in cosmetics have toxic elements that build up in the body over time. Think of it as the same or worse as consuming undercooked meat or alcohol, Frian shuddered. Why didn't the High Priest tell me any of that? She asked. Out of practice, perhaps, Miss Lutzi answered. The higher one goes in the temples, the more one's time is taken up by paperwork and other things. It could also be a lack of experience. The Temple of the Six promotes its clergy based on seniority, but I've heard that politics and such can influence advancement in the Temple of the Four. Ironically, an acolyte or junior priest from a regular temple would have probably informed you of what I did, since they see far more people than the senior temple staff. I wonder if there's any way to put that bald old man through the ringer, Frian grumbled. My family donated a tidy sum for the service. What did that service include? I identified 5 first-tier spells and 4 second-tier spells cast during the ceremony. There was the examination before that, of course, but he didn't find anything wrong with me, which only made me wonder why he cast all of those spells. Ludmilla and her maid exchanged a look. I believe Lian would call that covering his ass, Ludmilla said. He couldn't find anything wrong, but he cast spells that dealt with the common problems anyway. It seems that even the temples in the Empire are very imperial. What's that supposed to mean? Frian frowned. That the Baharuth Empire, from the Emperor on down, seems to prefer overpowering their problems. Whether it's crushing people with laws, rewriting public perception through information control, running things down with Imperial knights, or blasting its worries away with magic, even the underhanded scheming works toward the ultimate goal of overpowering an opponent. We like acting decisively. And I'm curious where that will ultimately lead you, Ludmilla said. We should go and find Rangobart. Dimir, would you be so kind as to give Frian a copy of your notes? Sure. You took notes? Frian asked. It sounded important. Dimir adjusted her spectacles. When I'm big and powerful, I'm going to have kids too. Assuming your parents don't marry you off before then. No way. I'll grow like Veronica and find my very own Ludwig. Ludmilla placed her hand lightly on the small of Dimitri's back and gently guided her back down the stairs. Frianne straightened her outfit before going to join them outside. There, they found Rangobart standing with someone she hadn't seen since her graduation. Nemel? Prez? The sign of House Gran came over to tug at Frianne's blanket tearfully. Prez, get this. Rangobart stalked me all the way to Wardensvale. Huh? Rangobart, Frianne said, this isn't the academy anymore. You stalked Miss Gran during your academy years? Ludmilla frowned. What? No. I was just looking out for her. Rangobart snapped his mouth shut, but it was too late. I was recently informed that you moved here, Nemel, Frianne said. I arrived this spring, Nemel nodded. It's been a crazy few months, but, overall, things feel like they're going well. Have you noticed any problems with the new registration procedures? Ludmilla asked. Nothing that isn't unavoidable, my lady, Nemel replied. The post office's identification procedures are a bit much for arrivals to handle, but they don't cause any permanent damage. Then the choice is between freezing every night for no reason and getting registered. Pretty much. I managed to get a few to come by having the men bring them, but I had to wait until the morning rush was over or they'd try to swim back home. A small group of commoners adorned in the garb of poor Imperial urbanites was clustered nearby, occupying a point equidistant from the Death Knight standing by the sign, a Death Knight standing sentry further down the street, and the plants that were crawling around outside of Ludmilla's makeshift manor. You brought people from the Empire? Frianne asked. They're spares from our winter that signed up to move here, Nemel answered. Mostly originating from my family's fief. I suppose that this was never mentioned in the court council sessions. It's my first time hearing about it, Frianne said. With everything that's been going on, the Ministry of Domestic Affairs is already drowning in paperwork. A wagon rolled into the village square, driven by a vampire in a postal service uniform. Or maybe the Soul Eater was driving it and the vampire was just riding along. Distressed noises issued from the group of migrants as they shifted away from the road and the wagon rolled to a stop in front of Ludmilla's manor. The vampire disembarked and came over, bowing low in greeting. Good morning, Baroness Saradnik. Good morning, Ludmilla replied. Don't let me get in the way of your work, Miss Gran. Nemel nodded and went to address her people. Frianne watched curiously as they lined up in pairs in front of the door to Ludmilla's place. What does this registration involve? Frianne asked. It's probably easier to see for yourself, Ludmilla said. Will that be all right? The process is hardly confidential. It's not much different than registering family members at the local hall. Actually, that's exactly what's going on now. The men are settlers from the first wave of migrants. They're registering their new wives who recently arrived. I see. It sounded simple enough. In the Empire, the first wave of pioneers to a frontier was almost always exclusively men. Women came once a new settlement was secured and solidly on the path of development. Nemel had prudently taken advantage of a well-known process to avoid many of the headaches that would have otherwise happened. Single women looking for husbands would always come so long as they knew their prospective partners had some land or a license, and men were easier to recruit if they knew they would be able to get a wife. Once the first couple entered the manor, Ludmilla brought them back inside and they stood amidst the small jungle in the hall to watch. Gyah! Dimitra cried, something licked my ankle. Shh! Dimitra quieted down as the vampire shushed her with a stern look. The buxom postal officer's attention then turned to the skinny woman trembling in front of the counter, lavishing her with a smile that straddled the line between seductive and obscene. Pale fingers with enviously perfect nails lightly tilted the woman's chin upward. Do not resist, the vampire commanded in a sultry voice. Her crimson gaze flared, and the woman's trembling ceased. A chill traveled down Frianne's spine. That vampire just dominated her. It was one of the hallmarks of their kind, but there were few descriptions of it in action. A fight against a vampire with reasonable odds of victory could quickly turn into a massacre if a member of a subjugating force fell prey to the ability. What is your name? The vampire asked, her quill hovering over some sort of form. Laura. Laura Coulson. How old are you? 15. And you have agreed to become this man's wife? I think he'll do. Frianne winced. They were using domination magic to collect truthful statements, but it seemed that there were some hidden pitfalls. Unlike regular charm spells, self-preservation didn't factor into how the target of a domination effect answered questions or carried out commands.
It should be fine, I think. They've just recently met, after all.
After collecting several forms worth of information, the vampire unfurled a scroll on the counter between them.
Please sign here. I can't read or write, Laura said. What does it say?
This scroll contains a list of items that you may freely obtain as a new resident. The woman took another quill from the counter and marked the document. The vampire stamped the scroll and sealed it before holding it out. Welcome to the Sorceress Kingdom, Laura Coulson. The vampire bride smiled pleasantly. You may redeem the items on this list at the shops across the village square. Serve His Majesty well. With that, the woman stumbled back a step. She shook her head and rubbed her eyes, whimpering at the realization of what had happened. Ludmilla crossed her arms. No matter how nicely we do things, we always get that reaction. Because they were just subjected to a hostile magic effect, obviously. Laura's husband picked up the scroll from the counter and silently bobbed his head before leading his new wife back outside. When the next couple came in, a sense of morbid curiosity over what the next woman would say kept her from leaving. After all 6 couples were registered, they went back outside. Rangobot gave Freyan an unreadable look. What is it? She asked. Women are brutal creatures, he said. We are realistic, Freyan sniffed. It's men who have unreasonably romantic expectations nestled in their little glass hearts. Nemel walked up to the group of migrants, clapping her hands twice to get their attention. All right, everyone, she said in her characteristically cheerful voice, it's time to go shopping. The group of migrants followed after the seneschal. Ludmilla's group followed after the migrants. They crossed the village square to the main row of storefronts, stopping at an oddly constructed boutique. Something seems off about this building, Freyan said. The shophouses here don't have workshops or warehouses attached, Rangobart said. Each one is just an outlet for goods. That's strange. Why were they built this way? I've consolidated the local mundane industries into several chartered companies with this latest group of new buildings, Ludmilla told them. Each artisan owns a share in the company and contributes their own product line. Dedicated merchants run the storefront while the artisans focus on their craft in the manufactory behind this building. Dimmer looked up at the sign of the building. Didn't that one group try something like this in our winter a few years ago? They did, Freyan nodded. It ended in catastrophe. What happened? Ludmilla asked. Infighting, Dimmer said. They kept trying to undermine one another, bribing the merchants to promote their products over their partners and other sneaky things. The merchants working in the storefront were competing against one another too. They kept undercutting to make sales, some even offered promotional gifts to entice people to deal with them. In the end, one guy bankrupted himself and set the store on fire out of spite. A whole block in the second-class district burnt down. Rangobart scoffed. That sequence of events seems an obvious thing, he said. I suppose it's harder to light stone buildings on fire, but there hasn't been any hint of that behavior, Ludmilla said. That sort of thinking is unthinkable on the frontier. If a group of people acted like that out here, a troll would come along and eat them all while they were fighting one another. You still get attacked by trolls? Rangobart frowned. No, Ludmilla said. Though I would consider sending the resident trolls after those types of troublemakers. The women entered the boutique and each was allowed to have their choice of 2 sets of work clothes, boots, a nightgown, small clothes, and a set of towels and blankets. Despite the size of the shop, most of its offerings were unassuming in appearance. Ludmilla fished up some new clothing for Freyan, as well. Their next stop was the outlet next door, where the newcomers received various odds and ends, including cookware, utensils, dishes, bar soap, and clay pots to store things in. Did they even need to pack anything from the Empire? Rangobart said. I'm sure they brought some articles of sentimental value, Ludmilla said. Barring their specific vocation and location, however, everyone gets the same start here. That's quite generous of you. People often don't know what they need out here, so it's better to just make sure they have everything that they need. By the time they were done with the second outlet, everyone had so much stuff that each person had to put it all into a barrel and load it onto a wagon. Freyan grew alert as they came to their next stop, which had a variety of potions and magic items on display. I recall you saying something about using potions instead of priests back when you were with us on the Blister campaign, Rangobat said, but you're giving out magic items, as well? Our magic item production is steady enough that we can supply what few immigrants we get, Ludmilla said. They receive a kit with potions for almost anything that can happen to them in their new homes. Additionally, they each get a temperature control item, a water source, 2 light sources, a preservation item for uncooked meat, and another preservation item for other food. Frian eyed the shelves, trying to tally the total value of everything Ludmilla listed. Needless to say, it was far beyond the means of most. All but the residents of the Empire's first-class districts and the wealthier citizens of the second-class districts would be able to afford the expenditure. If the average resident of our winter's third-class district saved up their discretionary income to make the same purchase, it might take them a decade or more. Isn't this far too much? Frian asked. What are your production costs like? They're quite reasonable, actually, Ludmilla answered. These items only come with a new registration, however. Anything beyond that becomes a personal expense at the prices you see listed here. Even so, Rangobat said, the cost of doing the same thing in the Empire would be crippling. I assume you've made some calculation in regards to how long this investment would take to pay itself back in rent and taxes. I have, Ludmilla replied with a nod. It doesn't take long. My subjects make personal purchases quite frequently. How can that be? A purchase like this would represent decades of a common laborer's wage. Even if they hold a tenancy, I can't imagine anyone buying more than one of these items every year. Well, that's where your visit comes in. I've pretty much given up trying to explain in words how different things are in the Sorceress Kingdom. Especially when it comes to my territory. Let's move on, shall we? So good. Frian walked out of her guest villa. Calling it a guest shop house felt too weird, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't known she needed. Ludmilla walked out behind her and lightly shut the door before strolling back with her to the row of outlets on the western side of the too large village square. They came across Timuia sitting in one of the shaded benches facing the shops, taking notes on some sheets of summon paper. You are not going to be able to carry all your observations back at this rate. Frian looked at the thick pile of already used paper beside Timuia. I'll hire a wagon if I must. Timuia replied, then looked up at Frian with a frown. Did something good happen, Prez? I suppose you could say that, Frian smiled. The salve that Ludmilla recommended worked wonders. I'm amazed that something like it exists. You probably don't see it in the Empire because it isn't deemed practical, Ludmilla said. I'll practical anyone in the face with a fireball if they claim that, Frian muttered. My mother's only advice was to not scratch, so I just sat around trying not to go crazy. Was it really that bad? Timuia asked. Your turn will come, Frian answered. Who created this salve, anyway? It even removes stretch marks. My chambermaid started complaining about the same thing halfway through their pregnancies, Ludmilla said. I remember my old villagers talking about it as well, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to ask my alchemists if they could come up with something. It's quite handy, especially with so many new families on their way throughout my fief. I bet it would still sell in the Empire, Frian said. Any noble woman going through the same thing would snatch it up without a second thought. How much does it cost to produce? Not much, Ludmilla replied. The problem is limited supply. You'll find this to be an overarching theme when it comes to my territory. Frian looked beyond the square to the vast wilderness surrounding them in all directions. How could that be? If Ludmilla said that the salve didn't cost much to produce, Frian could only assume that the reagents weren't rare. Shouldn't that naturally bring the price of everything up? Frian asked. It might if it was something that a pharmacist could concoct, Ludmilla answered. So you mean to say that it costs mana? Ludmilla nodded. Mana economies are tricky to juggle, she said. Unlike collecting physical resources, it's not something we can directly solve by piling on more undead labor. However, working within the restrictions of a mana-based economy and the perspective that it gives has proven instrumental in identifying and embracing the systems that exist in my territory. A society bound by its mana economy? It was an intriguing notion. The Empire, or any other society that Frian knew of, for that matter, treated its mana economy as unnecessary in the mundane affairs of the country. In the Imperial administration's view, magic casters were something like cream to be skimmed off of greater Imperial society for the exclusive use of the Empire. They even had several formulas to help them figure out how much of that cream existed for collection, which informed the state's quotas for recruitment and industrial development. This need to control its minor economy was essentially the backdrop to the Empire's long power struggle with the temples. It couldn't try to directly wrest control away, so all it could do was keep the temple's political power in check while looking for ways to undermine their practical monopoly on healing magic. If you've pinned your mundane economy to your mana economy, Frian said, your growth will be incredibly stunted compared to conventional development. When phrased in those terms, Ludmilla said, that's not wrong. But whether something is considered stunted or not should depend on local policy and development goals rather than comparisons to other economies. In many situations, it is unavoidable, especially when those comparisons are made to ensure survival. In others, it's a product of behaviors induced by subconscious subservience to savage instinct. The Empire has gone from the former to the latter with its admission as a client state of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. We cannot simply bind ourselves to our mana economy, Frian said. Well, I suppose that we could, but millions would perish in the process. The Empire would be a hollowed-out shell of its former self. I'm not demanding that you do, Ludmilla replied. Additionally, your notion of a mana economy as being the net mana throughput of all magic casters participating in a system only covers a fraction of what I account for in this territory's mana economy. By certain measures, the Empire is already operating within the limits of its mana economy, so it's not as worrisome a thing as you think. You are going to have to elaborate on what you're saying, then. I'll try, Ludmilla said. But first, where's Rangobart? Dimmer pointed to the outlet selling alchemical goods and magic items. He's in there being a Rangobart, she said. They found Rangobart at the counter of the shop surrounded by a half-dozen women of varying ages. Every one of them was competing for his attention by offering him information that he wanted to know while simultaneously employing their feminine charms in a bid to keep that attention. I'm shocked that this can happen here, Frian said. Why is that? Ludmilla asked. No offense intended, Frian answered, but followers of the Six always struck me as prudish. It isn't as if one ceases being human if they worship the Six, Ludmilla said. Besides, all of those women are arcane casters. Rangobart is quite the catch from their perspective. Did you invite him over as a stud? Officer Reburbad, Ludmilla called out. I won't get in the way of your romantic adventures, but they must remain here. I'm not trying to embark on any romantic adventures. Rangobart squeezed his way out and straightened his coat. Are we ready to depart? Yes, Ludmilla replied, then looked past Rangobart's shoulder. Miss Lanez, we need you to come along, as well. Sweet. A blonde woman showing off her curvy figure beneath her open brown robe came up behind Rangobart with a grin. This is Germaine Lanez, Ludmilla said. A master at our Faculty of Alchemy. Is she the creator of that salve? Frian asked. Which salve? Miss Lanez asked. Frian reached into a belt pouch and produced a glass jar. She held it out so the alchemist could see the label. Ah, the belly butter, Miss Lanez nodded. Ham did most of the work figuring that one out. Another master at the faculty? Nope, an apprentice working at our lab in the upper reaches. She collaborated with Vicar Aspasia, a cleric on the expedition that's running somewhere down there, to come up with a working formula. Isn't research beyond that expertise of an apprentice? Experimentation is one of the cornerstones of alchemy. Why wouldn't she be doing her own research? A difference in culture, I suppose, Frian said. Grant holders dictate what gets researched in the Ministry of Magic. Apprentices in private workshops pay off their indentures through their work, just like any other apprentice under the guilds. I see. Well, it's like they say, too much control stifles innovation. In Riestais, the people in charge didn't care much at all about magic, so magic casters there aren't exactly bogged down by demand for their products and services. We generally did what we wanted outside of feeding ourselves. Frian pondered Miss Lanez's words. They were extremely counterintuitive. One would assume that the Empire, with its long-term investment in national institutions for magic, would overwhelm the pitifully mundane Riestais in the field of magical innovation. Though you say so, Frian said, The Empire is clearly the leader between the two countries when it comes to all things magical.
In scale, for sure, Miss Lanez admitted.
When it comes to one's personal understanding of magic, however, I bet an apprentice wizard in the Empire only knows what their master deigns to teach them. Come to think of it, you have that magic academy, too. Everyone's probably forced to learn the same thing. The chance of having independent thinkers is slim when success is reliant on adhering to someone else's standard. They're functional standards, Freyan told her. I won't claim that the way we do things is perfect, but the Imperial Magic Academy provides its students with the foundation that they need to help build the Empire. And while the Empire lays that foundation, you bury the only childhood that those students have. The best time to experiment, make mistakes, and learn is when you're young. By the sounds of it, the Empire's mages don't get that chance until they're old and can't afford to screw up anymore. Miss Lanez couldn't have been more than 10 years her senior, yet she unflinchingly argued her case. Freyan wondered what sort of background she had to hold such conviction in her views. When do you start flinging spells at one another?
Ludmilla asked.
I'm not going to attack someone just because they disagree with me, Freyan answered. Oh, Ludmilla looked down with a deflated look. You don't have to look so disappointed. Outside of the shop, they found one of the strange carriages that had picked them up in the harbor waiting for them on the street. When it came Rangobart's turn to board, he stopped with a foot on the steps. What's wrong? Freyan asked. She poked her head around his arm. Asked. The women from the shop had gone ahead of them and taken their seats in the carriage. They all looked expectantly at Rangobart, waiting for him to choose who to sit next to. Ow! Rangobart jerked to the side as Dimir came up and kicked him in the ankle. Even though you're just a Rangobart, she fumed, don't get cocky. The nobleman looked at his assailant with the most confused expression that Freyan had ever seen on him. Dimir drove him into the wagon, pushing him all the way to the front and sitting down beside him. Why does it seem that all of the mages are women? Freyan half said to herself. Because all the men went back already, Miss Lanez said. The women stayed behind for Studobart. Freyan shook her head and boarded the carriage. She went to sit down beside Dimir and Ludmilla took the last seat in the row. Where are we going now? Freyan asked. The Citadel district, Ludmilla answered. I was wondering whether to go from the top down or the bottom up, but, since you asked, we can start there first. I asked? You wanted to see how I used alchemy to substitute for the shortage of temple staff in the fief, Ludmilla said. The Citadel district is where our faculty of alchemy is located. Her back was pressed into the cushioned bench as the carriage rolled out of the village. Dimir adjusted her spectacles as she looked around the cabin. Hey, she said, I'm not getting my butt massage. This carriage is different from the one that we used before. The one from yesterday was a prototype using new materials, Ludmilla said. This carriage is the model in regular service. Freyan looked around the cabin, noting that the seats were not only cushioned, but the carriage also wasn't threatening to shake itself apart. The windows had glass panels installed and the interior had been enchanted with temperature control magic. Overall, it felt like a cross between a wagon bed and a passenger carriage. How many of these carriages are there? Rangobart asked. They don't seem to be made for private use like the carriages we're used to. You are right, Ludmilla nodded, they are not. These carriages are designed for my territory's public transportation network. A dozen of them run regular service on 3 main routes. A dozen more will be added by winter. Freyan already knows this, but the rest of the Sorceress Kingdom has a similar public transportation service using passenger carriages manufactured by House Wagner. Does it cost anything for the people to use? No, Ludmilla said. The idea is that it promotes mobility and thus commerce, which will generate revenue for the country. It's also important for the transmission of ideas and we're also trying to avoid doing anything that would give people excuses to avoid the undead. I see, Rangobart said. I suppose it's trivial to provide a service like that if your horses don't need to eat and drive themselves. Nothing is stopping you from doing the same thing for your new territories, Ludmilla said. While the rest of the Empire may still balk at fully taking advantage of what we offer, the benefits that they bring to your domain are abundantly clear. I understand that, Rangobart sighed. Everything's just still so intangible that I'm not confident making any decision. All I can do is look at my options while I wait for information. What information are you waiting for? About a fifth of the Second Army Group received titles for the Blister campaign, Rangobart replied. Even in the best of situations, there aren't enough surveyors for all of the new land, and it's far from the best of situations in that regard. Lady Wagner suggested that I commissioned the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild. I received some sort of promotional offer from the Sorcerer King, as well. Will you be taking them up on their offer? Ludmilla asked. There's no better choice, Rangobart answered. At least as far as I can tell. Ludmilla turned her attention forward, her gaze going to some place ahead of them. In the distance, a large hill that could barely be seen from the village loomed on the horizon. Several complexes of the same, simple, theme as the structures in the village were built around its base. The Adventurer Guild is on an expedition in the Abelian wilderness at the moment, Ludmilla said, but it's more like a practical exercise than an official expedition. I don't think it would be a problem to shuffle in trainees so they can start working in the Empire. It will still take a while to move everyone around, though. They'll still probably get to my domain before I do, Rangobart said. Actually, I wouldn't mind going with them. It would be my first time seeing my land. I believe that can be arranged, Ludmilla said. I'm sure that both the Empire and the adventurers will find it reassuring to have you close at hand for consultation. Until then, I should see about familiarizing you with their work. They seem to get along quite well. Was it due to their time together in the Second Army Group? Maybe Rangobart had become used to interacting with martial types. Their carriage stopped beside a large set of buildings that gave the feel of an army base. From what Frianne could see, they were even conducting drills deeper inside. This is our stop, Ludmilla said. You'll have to sign in at the office here. The Citadel district is a restricted area. Once Frianne, Ludmilla, Dimir, Rangobart and Miss Lutzi disembarked, the carriage continued on its way. Frianne's eyes narrowed as she took in how large the hill to their south was. How large is this Citadel district? She asked. It's 5 kilometers from north to south, Ludmilla answered. 4 kilometers from east to west. Your district is half again as large as our winter. All of the big, space-eating institutions will be located here. The army base here is slightly larger than the city of Eranthal. The various vocational institutes and their dormitories will take up the rest of the area around the hill. What about the hill itself? That's where the Citadel will be built. She looked at the hill again. If she guessed correctly, the Citadel would be as large as a major city. Truly, they didn't do anything small in the Sorceress Kingdom. How long do you expect this all to take form? Rangobart asked. I'm not sure, Ludmilla said. As you can see, some of it is already there. How the rest grows will depend on how my domain grows. And her domain won't be growing quickly due to how she's tied its growth to its mana economy. By the sound of it, it was a vision that would take centuries to take shape. Frianne had no idea how Ludmilla could so confidently plan so far ahead. Would the Sorceress Kingdom guarantee that everything would come to pass even after she was long gone? They walked into a simple office where a single elder lich stared at them as they approached the counter. Frianne suppressed a shudder as its crimson gaze seemed to bore into her. Any problems completing the paperwork? Ludmilla asked. None, the elder lich answered. The undead mage placed several cards on the table. Ludmilla passed them out and Frianne frowned at what was written on hers. Hello. My name is Frianne. Did the elder lich write that? It felt cheerfully out of character, if so. Stick those where security can see them, Ludmilla said. Or you might get stuck instead. Dimir stuck hers on her forehead. Ludmilla led them back out and around the front office, where they got a good view of the undead drilling on the stony fields. Hundreds of Death Knights and Death Warriors moved in unison as their sergeants walked up and down the ranks. It took Fluda Paradine and half of the Ministry of Magic to subdue one of these things. Can anyone expect to prevail over such terrible power? I still don't understand why they need to train, Frianne said. Specific training is essential in allowing them to act optimally in various situations and environments, Ludmilla said. Rangobart can attest to the difficulties that military forces can face even when fighting in battlegrounds that they've prepared for. That's true, Rangobart said, though most of the problems were less about hitting things and more about reaching them. I think that it's something that anyone who fights the Death Series servitors learns quickly, Ludmilla nodded. Did it happen in the Draconic Kingdom, as well? Rangobart asked. Oh, yes, Ludmilla replied. We had the additional problem of fighting in the rainy season there. The entire country turned into mud, the Death Cavaliers were next to useless as a result, and the Beast Manhunters ran circles around our infantry. They never entertained the idea of engaging us in conventional battle unless they knew they could destroy our troops. The Beastmen had forces that could destroy Death Series servitors?
Yes.
They were nothing like the stories we heard about the Draconic Kingdom suggested. The Draconic Kingdom occasionally sent requests for raid to the Empire, which were always summarily ignored. It was a good thing that they were, or the Empire might have lost entire army groups. The 6th Army Group will be resuming its campaign in the south at some point, Rangobart said. Should we expect to run into adversaries of similar strength?
They actually did on their first campaign, Ludmilla said.
Fortunately, Wagner and Gonye reached the Wyvern Rider tribes before General Ray's forces got themselves wiped out by them. Before that, they ran into a mountain troll tribe and a magical beast that could have done the same. I'm beginning to think whoever is responsible for my transfer is trying to get me killed,
Rangobart grumbled.
I'm sure that General Ray has learned much from the experience, Ludmilla smiled. Hopefully, the two of you get along. I don't doubt that he'll be taking full advantage of your talents. After observing a different field where Death Series servitors were engaging in personal combat, Ludmilla brought them out of the army base to catch the next passenger carriage heading south. It dropped them off in front of the Faculty of Alchemy a few minutes later. I'm beginning to see how you get all these buildings up so quickly. Frian examined the dormitories framing the main building. Everything is very, Same. An advantage to building temporary structures, Ludmilla said. Parts can be mass-produced without needing to know precisely where they're going. Our masons eventually worked out the system that you see used for all of the buildings in my domain. Wait, did you just say that these buildings are also temporary?
That's right. Once we have a better idea of the faculty's needs,
we'll be replacing these buildings with new temporary buildings. The one you see in front of you is essentially several warehouses attached to one another through a central corridor, with each warehouse serving as a workshop. Upon entering the building, they found themselves in a front office that was identical to the front office of the army base. In addition to the elder lich at the counter, Miss Lanez was awaiting them with 2 apprentices in tow.
Welcome to the Faculty of Alchemy, she said. Prepare to be amazed at all the wonders we have in store for you. You didn't add any unnecessary extras for this visit, did you? Ludmilla asked.
Would it be bad if I did?
Yes. Miss Lanez glanced over her shoulder at one of her apprentices. The apprentice disappeared into the door behind him. So, the Master Alchemist said, where would you like to begin?
I'd like an overview of your production facilities for healing potions and other restoratives,
Frian said.
Sure thing. Miss Lanez turned around and gestured for them to follow.
I guess I should have expected that.
The Empire's our biggest customer for restoratives at the moment.
We are?
You didn't know? The Imperial Army's been buying up everything that they can. Those guys have been on the warpath since the beginning of winter. The reorganization of the Imperial Army has allowed us to better equip our soldiers, Frian said. They are not necessarily going to war. The alchemist had her back turned to her, so she couldn't tell whether she believed her or not. A few dozen meters down the corridor, they stopped at a nondescript door.
Here we are, Miss Lanez said.
Workshop A.
The plainest of the plain.
They stepped into a spacious workshop with alchemical equipment forming several aisles. Everything was completely utilitarian in its arrangement, and the brown-robed alchemists worked in a no-nonsense manner that suggested that they wanted to be done with their tasks as quickly as possible. In all, it wasn't anything that Frian hadn't seen before.
I can tell by your looks that this ain't anything new, Miss Lanez said. Any questions?
Is this the only workshop producing restoratives?
Rangobart asked.
It's the only workshop producing normal restoratives. Put plainly, potion production involves preparing a solvent and imbuing it with the appropriate spell. It's not something that requires a custom process for every potion. If we are making 100 potions, we prepare 100 potions worth of solvent the day before. Then, we imbue 100 potions and prepare the next batch of solvent. As she spoke, an apprentice walked by them with a crate full of herbs. She placed it on a counter where a set of men and women were busy preparing reagents. How do you procure your ingredients? Frian asked.
They are harvested from the surrounding wilderness.
Since they're wild plants, Potions made with them are about 10% more effective than the garden-cultivated herbs that most alchemists source from. Wouldn't that make supplies limited and unreliable for your production methods?
Not at all, the alchemist replied. Baroness Zaradnik's territory is so huge that we can massively outproduce a city's worth of alchemists. We had to tell the rangers to stop picking so many damn herbs because we can't get through them fast enough. Any other questions? They stared silently at Miss Linnes for several moments before she clicked her tongue. I was hoping for more interesting questions, she sighed.
Well, maybe they'll pop up later. Lady Zaradnik, how far in am I allowed to take them?
They only have basic security clearance, Ludmilla said.
That's it? MMH, there are only a few other workshops they can enter, then. At least they're all more interesting than this one.
What does she mean by that?
Frianne gave the alchemist a sour look as she walked back out into the corridor. She called the workshop that they were in the plain one, but, personal tastes aside, every alchemist's workshop looked like that. What makes them more interesting? Dimeo asked as they followed her to the next door. Because they're not mere production facilities, Miss Linnes answered, they are where the frontiers of alchemy are explored.
What does that mean?
That's a good question. The alchemist crossed her arms.
Let's see, to begin with,
have you ever asked yourself why reagents sourced from wild sources produce more potent products?
Not really.
I've heard from several colleagues that it was because they grew close to nature,
Frianne said. That's the usual answer. Is it not correct?
It's technically correct, but it doesn't answer the question.
Miss Linnes stopped and opened the next door.
Frianne shivered as a frigid mist flowed out into the corridor. To get the actual answer, we must first gain a basic understanding of the primal foundations of the world.
Does
everyone have endure elements?